Okay, so I'm going to speak about product design sprints. And we're going to start, what is a design sprint? So design sprint is a framework for teams of any size to solve design problems in about 5 days. So it doesn't matter if you're a new company or you want to develop new features, you have any problems that you want to solve. It's a series of exercises to develop a joint understanding of the problem and how you may solve it. It was developed by IDEO and then further on with Google Ventures. There are a few companies that do design sprints, and I'm going to talk mainly about the one that Thoughtbot does, which is a tiny bit different. Why? A product design sprint allows us to set clear goals for the project and define methods of measuring the progress that we're doing towards those goals. Basically, it's an opportunity to know that your product idea is good enough for your users. It's an opportunity to gather small-scale data early, and there is still time to course correct. Part of the sprint includes also, besides figuring out what you want to do, is building a prototype and then testing it in front of real users to validate your assumptions. So basically, it's an opportunity, instead of guessing that you're doing the right thing, is to actually make something that people want. The goals and the objectives of a product design sprint is to make sure that you are focused on your core problem, to validate your ideas, to solve that problem, to allow your team to learn early and to learn often about how you can do that, and to help with cross-team collaborations and buy-in. You will need to run design sprints. You will need a facilitator or a sprint master that will lead the design sprint and to guide it from start to completion. That person helps to identify design challenges for the sprint and brings the team together. The sprint team is usually includes designers, developers, and product owners as a minimum. So at Thoughtbot, we would have at least one designer, at least one developer, and the clients. So the clients will be the ones with the initial product vision and the one that have the final say with what's happening with the product. A design sprint includes 5 days. Again, different companies call those days differently, but Thoughtbot calls them understand, diverge, converge, prototype, and test. When I looked for other options, you get ones that call maps, sketch, decide, prototype, and test. And Google Ventures call them 6 phases of understanding what you're doing, then defining what's the key strategy and focus, diverging, how might we explore as many ideas as possible, deciding of the best ideas and what you're going to build, then prototype, build an actual thing that you can test and validate it by testing it with real users. So let's go back to how Thoughtbot does a few things differently. So day 1 is understand. So it's all about gathering all the existing information and knowledge on the business, the customer, and the problem, and exposing our assumptions and the knowledge gaps that we have. From there, we can make plans to fill the riskiest knowledge gaps and validate or invalidate our riskier assumptions. On day number 1, this is an example of a day. So it starts with introducing a starting pitch. So we ask the client or the product owner to just tell us what the problem is and what they're trying to build. Then we gather research and competition overview. So we ask the client to tell us a bit about the background of the product and where it comes from. We review facts, assumptions, and questions. So when the product owner tells us about what they're trying to build, we actually pay attention to assumptions that they make. Well, the users will obviously do blah, or whatever it is. So we keep track of those assumptions about the product and review them throughout all the phases of the sprint. Then we also review past work that they've done. We define a problem statement. We get to know the users and who is going to use the products that we are trying to build. Then we rewrite or review the pitch that we started in the beginning of the day to see if it works with a problem statement, and we practice it again. Now, Thoughtbot really likes doing retrospectives. So every day, pretty much, in the design sprints, we wrap up with the daily retrospectives to see how the day went. To make a problem statement, this is an example that you can use, which is we believe that a user has this problem, which is our goal, and we believe that we can solve that problem by using a product or building a product, and then we will know if it's working when we have some metric to check that it is. Just to make sure that it is solvable and then how we might be able to solve it. This is a tiny bit different problem statement that you can have from a different company, just as an example. So basically, the first day is all about knowledge, getting as much knowledge as you can about the product and the background and the users and all the things. Now, somebody said once that to have a good idea, you must first have lots of ideas, which leads us to day number 2. Day number 2 is called diverge. And diverge, so instead of just choosing the first ready idea that you have in your mind to solve the problem, this day allows you and encourages the team to do the opposite. Just come up with as many ideas as you can, even ones that might not be feasible or realistic or viable, maybe not, but just come up with as many ideas as you can. Those ideas will inspire unique possible solutions. So an example day will be, again, we start with a pitch practice, just to get the client to practice how they're selling the product. We have a background recap from the day before, so we are all on the same page. We start generating solutions with different exercises. For example, Crazy 8, storyboards, sound critiques, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then once again, we wrap up with the daily retrospectives. Crazy 8 is an exercise that you come up with 8 ideas in 5 minutes, pretty much. So you really don't have much time to think what you want to do. You just get things out, whatever you can think of first. Storyboards is tiny bit different than the way Google Ventures does it, when they just ask people to pick one feature and then create a storyboard for them. We usually ask people to look at the Crazy 8s, pick up a few things, and then delve into them in more detail. So it's great when the group has a bit more time to think about what they want to do and how they want to do it, and develop those first ideas further a bit more. And then what we do the next stage after that, we do silent critiques. So if you see all the dots that you have there, we give people those stickers and we ask them to pick which features they think work for them, or which ones they think they are important. Which is this way, is everybody gets to voice an opinion and tell what they think is important, rather than ask the voice of the CEO what they want. Which leads us to day number 3, which is Converge. So on this day, the team reviews all the ideas from the day before, and then they choose between 1 to 3 ideas to continue for a prototype. I don't think I've ever done 3. I might have done 2, usually preferably if you can come up with 1 idea to build, because you only have 1 day to build stuff, so you want to be very specific. The goal is to take all the possibilities that we exposed over the past 2 days, and we find a single version of the prototype to build the next day. An example day of day number 3 will include, again, pitch practice. Then we have usually group votes on needs, wants, and desires. So if we ask everybody to come up with all the user stories that they can think of and put them on sticky notes, and then we group them into whatever we must have, which is our MVP, what are wants, which we do want to develop, during the engagement, and desires, which are maybe in the future when we have a bit more time. We review the problem statement again, including our assumptions, and then we create a user journey map, a critical path, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The next stage is wireframe sketches, which is the final storyboard, which we will use to build a prototype the next day. So it pretty much gives us an idea of what we need to do. And then we create an assumption test chart. And once again, we wrap up with a daily retrospective. So this is an example of a critical, well, this is not so much a critical path. We did a 1-day design sprint to try and improve our sales process, a thoughtbot. And we said, well, this is currently what's happening. And we just detailed whatever we did and where it can be improved. But usually a critical path starts from where the user starts and when they finish, which is the goal of the project. The assumptions and test chart includes three parts. It includes an assumptions, all the assumptions that we started and we kept track during the design sprint. And then we test it with an interview, or we test it with using the app with the user and looking at how they use it. And it's validated if there's an actual metric and a goal, actual metric for the goal to check that it's actually been achieved. And day number 4, prototype. So because we only have one day, we can't really go into a lot of detail about what we are building. So it has to be very lo-fi and very simple. So it's the most simplest you can get away with while still putting it in front of users. The day will usually include, so what we do is we divide and conquer. So usually the engineers in the design sprint will go ahead and build a prototype, which whatever you want to choose. So you can choose Keynote, you can choose InVision, you can use simple static HTML files, whichever works for you. And then the designer usually will go and work on the test interview preparations. So things that they will do, they will define the questions for the user interviews, they will define the tasks for the users to try and do, define post questions to ask after, and then confirm the appointments for tomorrow. Which leads us to day number 5, which is test or validate. So this is the final phase when we actually time to answer the hardest questions in design. Is this idea any good? And when we actually take the prototype and use it with actual users, and we get to see the users interact with the prototype and take notes. So an example of a day will be, we aim for 5 interviews in a day with 30 minutes. So it's 1 hour interview, 5 interviews a day with half an hour in between. While the designer does that, we usually have the developer start on writing user stories backlog. So you have something in the end of that week that you can start working on. In the end of the interviews, we review them, and then we wrap up the sprint and see whether we validated things or not. And then again, we do a sprint retrospective for the whole week, how the week went. What we want to see in the end of the week, we want to see what worked, what didn't work, and what was validated. What do we get in the end of a design sprint? So usually we get a refined and targeted product pitch, because we keep practicing every day. Define user personas. We learn more about who the users are, what their workflows are, what the problems are, how they're going to use the software that we're trying to build. We get a prototype that we can use to build the actual app. We get user insights. We get a backlog to start with. We get a better understanding of what needs to be built across the team and across team buying. So basically, it's 5 days to jumpstart your development, because life is too short to build something nobody wants. There are some resources here if anybody's interested in design sprints and a bit more information on how to do them. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Out of all of those points, all of those things that customers need to do when they're engaged with you, what do you think is the one that they find the most difficult?
So what do clients find most difficult when they interact with us? So they usually find the most difficult to sketch ideas on day number 2. And we usually say that you don't really need to know how to sketch. Even if you just write your ideas down, it's good enough. Quite a few times, yes. So doing it a few times, do you come up with a few good ideas or not? So I've done ones when we invalidated the idea. We just found that people would just not use it, and then it's saved the people paid for 5 days work and saved heaps of money, and then went and tried to find a different idea. We did validate some ideas, and then you come up with really an understanding across the board of what needs to be done, and a place to start because you have a backlog of how you get started. And I've found projects when you have people that want everything, absolutely like everything, and they want it done now. And then they understand that really for MVP, they need a subsection of all the things that they need. And the rest are nice to have, or maybe not even, but at least until you build it and you test it, you know, you don't really know whether you need them or not. So a few outcomes.
Do you get the people when they think their ideas are 100% solid?
Yeah.
How do you convince them that they might be not, and that they actually need to test them, and that's
Okay, so I think about it in two ways. One is, so some people think that they know best. How do you convince them that testing and doing this is a good idea? Is that correct? So I will say you have two options. One, you can tell them that they hire you, a consultant that have done this before or have done this many times with many startups, so you know what you're doing, and then they should trust you that, you know, this is a good idea. This is why they bring you in, pretty much, to test that it's working. But in the end of the day, it's their money, the way I look at it. I might not agree with it, but if they really insist that this is what they want to build, I have a problem with that. But in the end of the day, if they're willing to spend that money and waste it, which I look at it as wasted, it's their money. I can't convince them otherwise. Yeah.
What, when you're choosing a facilitator, what do you find is in the business you choose?
Preferably a UX designer and somebody that knows how to interact with people and think about the problem domain. But preferably a designer that understands user experience practices. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you find the balance in small teams when they're already working on a product to work on this and come up with a new product? Is that correct? Currently, all our lives now are so busy with emails and interruptions and all the things that finding time to get everybody together in one room to do this can be hard. But in the end of the day, you can look at it in a couple of ways. One, in the end of the day, it's 5 days. We ask people to turn the computers off, turn their phones off unless on breaks, and pretty much just concentrate on what we do now, and you get the most attention out of them in 5 days. You can do a design sprint in 2 days if you want a small problems or if you are really stuck for time. Pivotal does something with new clients that's called Inception Day. So it's 1 day. So it's those 5 days, almost, besides the prototype, you know, shoved into one. That's another option as well. The thing to remember, it's only 5 days. Life will not stop. You know, life can continue after 5 days. So there's a few services online that you can use that, especially if you can do them remotely. But usually we ask the client because the client knows their user base the best. So they probably know people that they can bring into interviews, and we ask them to organize that on day one of the design, for instance, because unless you start thinking about it from the beginning, it will not be done on the last day. Sorry, I did not repeat the question. It's how do you find users for the testing on the last day?